Jesus Christ, throughout his ministry, when he was assaulted by the naysayers, brilliantly answered their questions that were meant to entrap or convict him. He managed to walk the familiar streets of Israel and evade capture when it all but seemed assured. And Jesus did this without breaking any of the laws of God or man. But right at this time of the year, the one that we're currently in right now, the hedge that had been constructed around him by the Father would now be removed. Today, on the Hebrew calendar, it is the 10th of Abib, or Aviv, or Nisan, or Nisan, as the month came to be known after the Babylonian captivity. And there was a particular event that happened on this day that we see in Exodus 12, verses 2 through 6. In Exodus 12, verse 2, it says, "This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, the first month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household." And then we see in verse 5 that there was an inspection that was to take place. They were to make sure that the lamb met certain criteria. In verse 5 it says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, which is the day of Passover. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight." This is in effect what the Jewish and Roman governing bodies did at this time of the year, right up until Jesus' death and his sacrifice on the 14th day of the same month. Now, the Jews did everything possible to legally kill Jesus. But as we go through this thorough inspection of the very end of the life of Jesus, we'll see that he never sinned, that he never admitted to doing anything wrong, and eventually he was illegally murdered in spite of this inspection, this final inspection of Jesus. So as we go through this, notice how they tried their hardest to find fault, to find sin, how they bent and broke the rules to do so, and they still could not find that he had committed any infractions. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Jews in general, had long tried to find fault with Jesus and his teachings. So they had to now go to other means. In John 11, in verse 47, it shows what they finally had to resort to. John 11, verse 47 says, "Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, 'What shall we do? For this man works many signs.'" So a lot of people had seen what Jesus had done, and they believed in him. And of course, some of them had seen the signs and went and told the Pharisees the things that Jesus was doing. And they saw it as a threat to them, to their authority, and to their quote-unquote reign. Verse 48, "If we let him alone," they said, like this, "everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation." Okay, so now they're starting to make up excuses, and they're starting to try to pull together these probabilities and make them as though they were assured in the way that they were going to happen. And of course, Christ did not come in this capacity at this time to take over the world and all the nations and the governments to become his. That was not the purpose of this coming, and so it was never his intent. But nonetheless, verse 49, "Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. So he's saying this in the fashion that, okay, Jesus is going to bring upon us the contempt of the Romans, and all of us are going to perish because of this one man. And so his reasoning was that shouldn't we then sacrifice this one man so that we should not all perish? Now, here's the interesting thing about it. In verse 51, now this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So Caiaphas, again, is saying this in regards to what he's thinking anyway, the way he's going about prophesying it as high priest, was that, oh, okay, yeah, let's just sacrifice him so that we don't all die, because he's causing all these problems. And in his mind, it was kind of killing two birds with one stone. Little did he realize, though, that the prophecy had specifically to do with what Christ came to do in his first coming. So, verse 53, then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. Okay, so they're not going to be able to do it in a straightforward manner. So now they have to plot and plan. So here we are, and if we pick up the story now in Matthew 26, again, you might want to just put this in your notes, or put little markers here so we can turn back and forth. Matthew 26 and 27, these chapters, Luke 22 and 23, John 18 and 19. These are going to be the chapters that we're going to put together. And as most of you know, the Gospels need to be harmonized. You have to put them all together, and by putting them all together, you get the full story. But it takes some going back and forth, so we'll be going back and forth through them pretty quickly. So again, just put some markers there so we can move to them readily. Matthew 26, 27, Luke 22, 23, and John 18 and 19. All right. So in Matthew 26 and verse 3, okay, the timing of it here is it's about 2 days before the Passover. Okay, whenever Christ is going to be crucified. And so in verse 3, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So they could not do it legitimately. Okay, and so as we go through here, take note of all the means by which they try to convict Jesus. And they cannot, because he was without spot or blemish. He was without sin. And so they still try to do this. And as we go through, note all the illegal ways they do it, and how also they were unable to even do it by that. So now they have to resort to secrecy through deception. And so they have no other means, because they really, at this point, exhausted anything and everything they had in terms of trying to trap Jesus. Now, by this time, Satan had already entered Judas Iscariot, and we pick up the story in John 18 and verse 2. John 18, verse 2. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciple. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priest and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So now he's being arrested, all right, in order to prevent this potential uproar among the people. So we're going to have to do this. And again, note the human reasoning and the things that they go through and they say, which are just excuses. So they sought how they might kill him, because they feared what the people might say or do if this went on into the holy days that were coming up. So notice when they did it, it was at night. Luke 22 and verse 47. Luke 22, verses 47 through 53. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, all right, Judas had already had Satan's influence now, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. And Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And then one of them, Peter, struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. And Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him. All right. So again, I find that fascinating that here he is. He continues to do the signs. He does a miracle in front of all these people who have come to take him under the cover of darkness. And he heals Malchus's ear back onto his head. And then they proceed almost as if nothing happened. And Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders who had come to him, have you come out as a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. So here they are, they're coming under this cloak of darkness, like he was some hardened criminal, when he always sat among them. Of course, they knew that. They knew that this was the case, but again, they had in their mind no other choice since the reasonable, quote-unquote, logical methods that they had tried before all failed. So now comes the inspection by the Jewish rulers. John 18 and verse 12. So in John 18, and beginning in verse 12, the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. All right, so it's worthwhile noting that they did not levy any formal charges against him upon taking him into custody, because there were none. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year that we mentioned before. Now, I'm not sure that Annas had any authority, but it's interesting that they brought him to Annas first, who was a previous high priest. Right? So now he's going to be interrogated by a person who is no longer in the official capacity of high priest, and in that sense had no authority whatsoever to do it, which is why they may have done it this way, as we will continue to see. Right? So first off, under Jewish law, all proceedings at night were prohibited. So no session of the court could take place before the morning sacrifice, which was typically around 9 a.m., okay, and or after the evening sacrifice, which was about 3 p.m. So the Sanhedrin sat between the time of basically 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., and this is the time in which they were to adjudicate. So here they are already off the books, being questioned by a former high priest. And so in my mind, they're trying to circumvent these rules by saying, oh, look, I mean, the high priest didn't do it. All right. This was just, Annas, who, quote unquote, really didn't have any authority, yet, of course, it carried some weight that he was a former high priest. So what does Annas do? He tries to get Jesus Christ to self-incriminate. Verse 19. So the high priest then asked Jesus about his doctrines and his disciples. And it seems to be in an attempt to gather evidence so that they could actually charge him with something. So they had nothing from before. Now they're going about this in an illegal fashion, trying to find something. Right? Verse 20, and Jesus said, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and the temple where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. So basically he was saying here, where is your evidence? If I have indeed said something amiss, there would be somebody out there to corroborate it. Where are they? Why are you not asking them? Why are you not gathering them together? And when he had said these things, verse 22, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? So, again, they're resorting to these gulag-style antics. And not only that, but it should be clear for us here that when he said this, he was not actually the high priest. And Jesus answered him and said, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. Tell me exactly the evil that I said. But if well, why do you strike me? So again, he's saying that then he didn't say anything out of sorts, and there was no reason to strike him. So they got nothing out of him. So the next step, verse 24. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, so again, Caiaphas, who we talked about, who is now saying it was expedient that one man should die. So Jesus is now being taken to be judged before the man who said that he should die. Seems like a little bit of a conflict of interest there. Not only that, but this trial seems to be taking place at Caiaphas' house, the house of the high priest, instead of the normal place where the Sanhedrin met. Of course, like we said before, this could only be legally done during the day, not at night, like they were doing. Verse 53 now of Mark 14. Let's turn over to Mark 14, verses 53 through 65. Mark 14, verses 53 through 65. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. And Peter followed them at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. All right, so we see where we are, the courtyard of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. So when Christ was brought before Caiaphas, no charge had been made against him. Okay, so this is, once again, we have to understand that the Sanhedrin could not originate the charges against Jesus. Otherwise, they would have to let him go. So here is Jesus showing up without any charges being made against him. And so if Caiaphas or the Sanhedrin were to try to originate, try to come to say, okay, let's bring a quote-unquote innocent man, let's start interrogating him so we can figure out what it is that he's doing wrong, this was illegal under Jewish law. Verse 56, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. So you have to have two witnesses who are saying the exact same thing, and the scribes, Pharisees, the Jews, the high priests, the Sanhedrin, they couldn't get their act together in order to even produce two false witnesses. They came up with the same exact bad, false, wrong accusations. Verse 57. It's a hodgepodge, and it's a mess what is going on here, and they're grasping at straws at every turn. Verse 57, then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy the temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. Again, that was patently false, untrue. He did not say that. But not even then did their testimony agree. So because it did not agree, they couldn't convict on the testimony of a single person. Verse 60, and the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? So again, trying to get Jesus to self-incriminate, perhaps to get him to agree in fashion with at least one of the false witnesses. But, verse 61, he kept silent and answered nothing. So he didn't corroborate any testimony. Plus, there was really nothing even to answer anyway. Again, the high priest asked him, said, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Verse 62, Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further need do we have of any witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. So again, now they feel that they have co-opted him and gotten something out of him that they can actually hold over his head. But this was not blasphemy. This was the truth. In the future, it was going to be that way. Not only that, but as we said before, this self-incrimination was not allowed. And some have said that this was even illegal, verse 64, according to the law at the time, that not all were able to be against him. There had to be at least one judge that would stand up for the accused. But what we see here is that they all condemned him. So yet another illegality. And then verse 65, some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to beat him, and to say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. So this wasn't legal either. I mean, common sense tells you it wasn't, but it wasn't legal from the point of view that he couldn't be punished twice for the same crime. Even if he was to be crucified, he was not allowed to have an additional punishment in this way. So now we kind of go and we change now from the inspection of the Jews to now Jesus being inspected by the Roman rulers. Let's turn over to John 18 and verse 28. John 18 and verse 28, and we'll read down to verse 31. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. So again, they were still doing it under the cover of darkness. It was not yet a time whenever they would actually be able to sit in judgment of this trial. But they themselves did not go to the praetorium lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So that they're heading over to Pilate's place or his palace, and this was the judgment hall where matters like this were to be brought. Now, for various reasons, in particular the fact that the holy days were coming up, they did not want to be defiled. Now, if you could just hold your finger here for 1 second, let's turn over to Matthew 27, verses 3 through 5. Just want to do this one little quick insert here, and that is that Judas introduces new evidence. All right? And we'll tell you why exactly this is significant. But Matthew 27, verses 3 through 5, it says, "Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.'" And so here it is. Judas is now introducing new evidence, right, saying that what he had done, he should not have done because Jesus was evident. So everything that he had brought before the scribes and Pharisees was not true, and they should not have been acting on it in that manner. And they said, "What is that to us? You see to it." Then Judas threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. Now, the significance of this, other than the fact that it shows that, again, what Judas did was wrong and that he did actually have nothing against Christ, is that when new evidence comes to light, even if it is from the accused, and even if he is on his way to being killed, the Sanhedrin is obligated to review this. Even if it happens multiple times, they are obligated to do it in order that they do not put to death an innocent man. So when Judas did this, they should have said, "Oh, okay, hold it, let's bring him back. In light of the new evidence, let's evaluate the situation." Of course, they were never going to do this. Now back to John 18 and verse 29. And again, I insert that because it was about the time that this happened, was whenever they were bringing him over to see Pilate. So John 18, verse 29, Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" So he was going to do his duty and not simply rely on the word of the Jews. Plus, he discerned that the Jews were envious of Jesus, as Matthew 27:18 shows us and gives us that insight. And they answered to him and said, if he were not an evildoer, would we not have delivered him up to you? So a very misleading answer. Surely they could, in terms of what they're trying to say to Pilate, show him saying, well, can't you see how bad the charge is if we are bringing him before you? Also, if they were to mention that the only thing that they had against him was blasphemy, they knew Pilate would have nothing to do with it since it was a Jewish religious matter. In verse 31, we can see even that being reflected here. Pilate said to them, you take him, judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Again, they're trying to get rid of their responsibility in the matter and trying to push forth their agenda to have him die. And of course, in the manner of things here, in the course of them, they insinuate that what he is accused of is worthy of death. So now, the Romans had allowed the Jews to implement the death penalty for capital offenses. So that's not what they're talking about here, and that it's not lawful. So here's another insight. According to Jewish law, the Sanhedrin was not allowed to hear a case involving a crime that was deserving of the death penalty on the day before the Sabbath or before a holy day, because under their law, they were not allowed to convict anyone more quickly than in 2 days. So in other words, they had to go through the proceedings on one day, quote unquote, sleep on it, which really meant that they were supposed to give it serious thought overnight. And what we have here then is the problem that the Jews were coming up against is that they had arrested Jesus on Tuesday night and they actually killed him on Wednesday. All right, so it wasn't even a whole day, and they wanted to accomplish all of this before the beginning of the first day of unleavened bread, which would begin that evening, Wednesday evening. So they were not, according to their law, allowed to put him to death because it would take 2 days, and they did not want to wait that amount of time. And through their trickery and plotting and planning, this is the way that they saw they could get around the law. So when this was not working here with Pilate and their approach to Pilate, they change their tack and they bring new accusations of Jesus. And we pick up the story now in Luke 23 in verse 2. Just hold your finger here. We'll just pick up this one part here. In Luke 23 verse 2, and they began to accuse him, that is Jesus, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So here they are, and we can go back to John 18:33. So we find that there are 3 accusations that were designed to make Jesus look like an enemy of the state, of the Romans, and a challenge to their authority. So even if they were all false, the last one, where he says he's a king, not even Pilate could just let that go. So now back to John 18 and verse 33. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered to him and said, are you speaking for yourself about this? Or did others tell you this concerning me? And Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? So now let's listen carefully to exactly what Jesus says in verse 36. My kingdom is not of this world. This is not where my kingdom is. Right? If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? And Jesus answered, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So he's saying, okay, when you look at these together, that he was a king of another kingdom, not of this world. So he didn't come here to foment violence. He didn't come to rule with a rod of iron, and the kingdoms of this world were not his, not just yet anyway. Verse 38, and Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, after Jesus said all of this, and that, again, the Jews were saying, hey, look, he's being treasonous. And Pilate then inspects him, interrogates him, investigates, says, I find no fault in him at all. So Pilate says in no uncertain terms here that Jesus is innocent. Back to Luke 23 and verse 4. Luke 23 and verse 4. And we'll go down to verse 17. Luke 23 verses 4 through 17. So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no fault in this man. Right? So here we are, we're picking up the story here. I just threw that in there just to harmonize what was going on. But they were more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, okay, that was it. He asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, okay, I'm sure he breathed a certain sigh of relief. That's my interjection. And he sent him, Jesus, to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. So now he saw a way out of this mess and immediately offloaded the problem to Herod. Verse 8. Now when Herod saw Jesus, okay, so here we have another step in the further inspection of Jesus by the Roman rulers. First Pilate, now Herod. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Herod was looking, in other words, to be entertained like he was with John the Baptist. That was up until he had his head cut off. Verse 9, then he questioned him with many words, but he, Jesus, answered him nothing. Nothing. Jesus didn't really have to say anything, especially since he had already been declared innocent by Pilate. Verse 10, and the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And they said this thing and that thing, trying to cast dispersions upon him, trying to show that he was indeed sinful. And then Herod with his men of war treated him with contempt, Christ, and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. But note what Herod did not do. He did not convict Jesus of anything. He did not pass any type of judgment. And least of all, say that Jesus was worthy of the death penalty. Verse 13. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, you have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, and indeed have examined him in your presence. I have found no fault in this man concerning the things of which you accuse him. And no, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him. And indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. So now for yet a second time, Pilate pronounces a lack of guilt and adds that Herod is with him on this. Verse 16, I will therefore chastise him and release him. What? Why? After he adjudicated the matter, found Jesus innocent, and Pilate said this twice, Herod once, and the Jews had not presented any evidence, why would he do this? He was not even deserving of this. So perhaps this was something to placate the Jews and give them a little bit of what they wanted to stave off, perhaps, the crucifixion. Perhaps if he could do this, they would drop all the crucifixion talk. So he even tries to sell it that Jesus Christ should be the one released at this time of the year, as it was their custom to do. Obviously, that did not work, but rather the Jews now smell blood in the water with what Pilate was now giving in on. So he gave in just a little bit. And they knew this, and I think they latched onto it. And then verse 17, it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. Now, Matthew 27, verses 15 down through 23. Matthew 27, verses 15 through 23. So hopefully you're just following the flow more than getting confused with this going back and forth. Of course, this will always all be online anyway. Now, at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. So again, the segue. So it was a forgiving of sins, so to speak. And at that time, they had this notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Right? And I think one version that I had perused called him a terrorist. Therefore, verse 17, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" Now, Pilate should have never done this. Jesus had been exonerated. But I think Pilate is being political here. For he knew that if they handed, for verse 18, which we had quoted previously, for he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. So not only did he know that the Jews were up to no good, but his wife also told Pilate, that he should wipe his hands of it. Verse 19, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, Pilate, his wife sent to him saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man." And there's some that believe that she was a Jew. "For I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." So she calls him a just man and tells Pilate of these disturbing dreams that she had. But verse 20, the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And the governor answered and said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" And so he's, in a sense, trying to pull for Jesus, trying to get him released after he's already exonerated him and has not found any fault with him. He says, there is no sin that I see in these accusations that you bring against this man. And so one last time here he pleads, and he says, they've cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." Now, John 19 and verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. Again, unfathomable. For no legitimate reason, Pilate, after saying all he has said and done all he's done, scourges him. Perhaps it was a misguided way of trying to avert the impending crucifixion. But nonetheless, here he is being scourged by Pilate. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," as they struck him with their hands and mocked him. Again, as we mentioned, this was illegal. Verse 4, Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Okay, this is the third time he says he's innocent. And of course, after he's already scourged him and allowed his soldiers to strike him and to mock him and to berate him. Verse 5, then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe that the soldiers had put on. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify!" Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." For a fourth time he found him innocent. Verse 7, and the Jews answered, "We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." So now they are becoming more open about this blasphemy that they were kind of putting and hiding under the table so that they could get Pilate to do what they wanted Pilate to do, and the things that they previously hid from him, now they are being much more overt about. Then, verse 8, Pilate heard that saying, heard what they were saying, and he was the more afraid. So now we perhaps see a little bit of this in his subsequent actions, that he's desperately trying to find a reason to let Jesus go, but he just doesn't seem to have the fortitude or the character to do it. Verse 9, so he went into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. And Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" So here's that hint. Say something so I can let you go. And Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Speaking of the Jews. Verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. He tried to, quote unquote, in this half-hearted measure. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." So now the Jews are threatening Pilate with treasonous acts, saying that, okay, how can you allow a man who says he's king right here, okay, in Caesar's area, to get away with such things? If you do this, we're going to tell on you. Verse 15, but they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So now they're saying they look to and they recognize the Roman rulership over them? No. It's only because it suits their cause now do they say these such things. Matthew 27 and verse 24. And we'll read to verse 26. Matthew 27, 24 through 26. We pick up the story. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, right? And again, that's something he didn't want to be responsible for. I think he got in trouble in the past for something like this that had happened, and he had his hand slapped for it. But when he saw that they could not be assuaged, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." Now, of course, he was not. Pilate could have released Jesus. Instead, he whipped him, allowed abuse by the soldier, and in both cases, I'm sure that blood was drawn. So he had blood on his hands. Verse 25, and all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." And I'm sure their children appreciated them bringing them into it like that. But what we need to understand even about this statement is that Christ's blood is on all of us. We are all responsible through our sinning. Christ's blood had to be spilled for each and every one of us. So in this respect, his blood is indeed on us, on all of us. And then verse 26, then he, Pilate, released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. John 19 and verse 19 through 22. John 19, verses 19 through 22. Now, Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, so everybody would know and could understand what the charges were. Therefore, the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather write this. He said, I am the King of the Jews. Now, the Jews, okay, in particular the chief priests at this time, wanted it to be written as a blasphemous claim. This would have been treason. So for one final time, Pilate admits nothing in regards to his guilt and answers in verse 22. What I have written, I have written. So he lets it stand, and in the very end, after all this inspection, there was not a charge that was found against him that he was to be guilty of. So what we see here is that the Bible confirms that Christ was murdered. Even throughout the illegal arresting, the interrogating, and the illegal trial of Jesus, no fault was found in him, even by these lawless men. In Acts 2, and verse 22 and 23, we see that Peter confirms this. In Acts 2, verses 22 through 23. Acts 2, verses 22 and 23. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, this is all part of the plan of God, you have taken by lawless hands and crucified and put to death. So again, Peter here is confirming that it was a lawless process that they went through. And if you could turn over to chapter 13, Paul also confirms it. In Acts 13, in verses 27 and 28. Acts 13, verses 27 and 28. For those who dwell in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not know him, nor even the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath. All right, so again, all these men that we're talking about, the ones who, the Jewish rulers who did this inspection, as I'm calling it, of Jesus Christ, okay, they have fulfilled them in condemning him. They have fulfilled the words of the prophets of the past, of the Old Testament. And though they found no cause for death in him, okay, no fault, no sin, they asked Pilate that he should be put to death. And when, again, if you want to read verse 29, and when they fulfilled all that was written concerning him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. So they did achieve what it was that they were seeking to achieve, that the things that Satan motivated them to do, their own carnality made them do in that respect. So during his time on earth, Jesus did not break the law. Hebrews 4 and verse 15. Hebrews 4 and verse 15. Again, I can just read it for you. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. So Christ went through, and as we recall, and we've gone through many times, Matthew 4 and Luke 4, that he was tempted in all points by Satan. And he did not sin. His walk on this earth was one of sinlessness. And not only did he follow and obey God's laws, but man, the Jewish rulers and the Roman rulers, could not find fault with him. And so because of this, then we see in 1 Peter 1, verses 18 through 19, that we are redeemed with the precious blood of Christ as a lamb, as of a lamb, without blemish and without spot, as was foreshadowed by this day thousands of years ago. So, brethren, as we come to this day, this 10th day of the first month, in the days leading up to Passover, 4 days from now, as we inspect, as it were, the flawlessness of the body that Jesus Christ laid down for us, as we prepare to partake of the symbols of Passover, let us realize that Christ indeed was without spot and blemish, and that he laid down his life, that he gave up and divested himself of his godhood for a time being, that we need to then be aware of the magnitude and awesomeness of this sacrifice and understand what this day means so that we can better keep it in the manner that we should.